Hello and welcome everyone to our webinar Wednesday presentation. Today is May 6, 2020. Welcome to our webinar Wednesday. The title of today's presentation is Supporting Student Transitions During the COVID-19 Community Crisis. My name is David Bernay and I'm the Vice President for Communications for International ACAC. And I'm excited to be joined by some excellent colleagues who will be presenting to you today. But before we get started in our webinar, I just wanted to, of course, go over some housekeeping items because at this point, if you don't know how to use Zoom, I'm not sure how to help you, but here we have some information for you about the question and answer box. You will see this in your dashboard. Please enter all the questions for the panelists using this question and answer tool. And keep in mind that you can ask questions anonymously. There's no issue there. We may be informally polling you throughout. If that's the case, you can use the raise hand tool. But the chat box or the chat messaging is typically not something that we will use during today's webinar. And we won't be monitoring it for questions at all either. So we have many of you who've joined us so far. And so we're going to go to our first poll question, which is who's in the audience? And so I'm going to launch the poll and get a sense of who's joined us so far today. All right, take your time now, get some voting in. We're almost there. Interesting, all right. So just so we can see, about half of you are from secondary schools, which makes sense given the topic of today's webinar, and then split a little bit between college and university, admission professionals, and independent counselors. Great. Well, thanks for that. We're going to have another poll in a little bit, but for now, I am going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, whatever time it may be where you're watching this. My name's Aleka Bylan. I've been an international school counselor for decades and am now working as an individual helping students in their transition to university. I am usually based in Jakarta, Indonesia, but I am currently in Central Oregon.
So, hi everybody, my name is Ellen Mahoney and I run Sea Change Mentoring. We work with international schools around the world, helping them build mentoring programs and SEL initiatives and advisory programs. And I'm in New York City right now, and you might even hear the cheering in the background because it's 7 o'clock. It's the time where we change shifts for medical personnel, and we all hang out our windows and bang pots and pans and say thank you to them and all the other essential workers today.
Hi, everyone. Oh. Hi, everyone. Am I there?
You're good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Bernie Lanou, and I've also been a school counselor for decades, most recently in Dubai, but now I'm in Seattle. And my wife and I have returned to the US, and I have started my own company, College Support International, and I'm working as an independent school counselor.
Thank you so much for our panelists for joining us today. One quick point before we move on and get started. I did want to mention to everyone that we are recording today's webinar and it will be available for you to view afterwards on the International ACAC website. And we will also be sending you out a copy of the presentation after the webinar today. So with that, I'm going to ask Aleka to begin.
Well, hi there. The first thing I wanted to do is thank so many of our members who completed a survey we sent out last week. And so we really went through this very carefully, and we looked at all of the different answers from around the world, and I'll share out some of those responses a little bit later. I think that what you need to know, though, is that we really felt the emotion and the difficulty and the challenges and the uncertainties that all of us are feeling at this time. I mean, it's wonderful that we are cheering the frontline workers, and I really feel that educators and counselors are on the front lines of education and at this moment. And so we felt that in the responses that came through the survey. So what we want to do is we want to address that. This presentation is much more on the mental health and well-being of you, the counselors in the secondary setting particularly, as well as the students that you're trying to care for and the parents that you're trying to support. We really hope that our higher ed colleagues that are listening right now can glean some of the factors that are impacting students. So then as you are going through your planning stages at your institution about opening, welcoming these class of 2020 members, et cetera, that you have a little bit of an idea of the landscape going forward. So next slide, please, David. So those of you who are social, emotional, personal, academic counselors or have been doing a lot of work in transitions are probably familiar with this acronym, which is called the RAFT. So really in building a raft is when we're in any kind of move or transition, we want to go through these steps in order to leave well so that we can enter well. So this is just a refresher for us because a lot of us are feeling a real cognitive overload. So we want to go back to remembering the basics. And the thing that's important about the raft is that it's very hard, as we know, to grieve well and leave well right now. So that's why we wanted to sort of remind everyone of the raft. And the other thing that I want you to understand as we're going forward through this presentation is that we've used the steps of building a raft in order to frame our conversation. So let's dig in on reconciliation. Next. So in the reconciliation, what we're trying to figure out is actually reconciling ourselves to the uncertainty of this situation and helping our students and our parents also come to terms with that. For example, thank you, in one of the questions on the surveys, what we saw is all of the worry and all of the fear in our membership with the uncertainty of this situation, right? I mean, are universities going to open at all? Are my students going to face online classes after they've already been facing, weeks and weeks of online learning now? Will there be the same price for university? What's going to be the impact on the class of 2021? Are embassies going to be open in order to process visas in time? There's so much concern and so much uncertainty. And the three of us are not here to answer those questions, but they definitely are informing us to understand that this is the kind of real drag that we're in this situation, and that we are all really in it together, and that uncertainty is global. I think one of the things that we're talking about in the pandemic is the fact that this is not over there. This is not, oh, those poor folks who are impacted by that natural disaster, political upheaval, etc. It is impacting all of us, and it will have a downstream effect for all of us. So let's continue on and see if we can share a few ideas about how to reconcile ourselves to this uncertainty. I think the first point is the hardest one. As school counselors, as educators, we have had the answers. We have been the experts. And so then losing the ability to have answers has been quite difficult for us. So instead, we sort of have to flip it a little bit, right? We have to be back into that listening mode of counseling. We also need to do the obvious, which everyone has been saying, right? Is the self-care, the connecting with others, getting on a phone call, walking if we can to get outside. Now, it's hard for us as counselors because we're trying to really help the students deal with it. And students are angry right now. And students, even to those schools who have reopened in this past week, students are uncertain. Things might be a little bit odd. The teacher may not be there. The peers may not be there. So I know that so many people around the world are doing individual meetings with their students, checking in. Some people are doing small groups. Sometimes it's helpful to do a small group organized by time zone because everyone is scattered in so many different places, and understanding that we just need to hold the space for those emotions to come up. We also are trying to enlist the partnership of our parents because they're the ones that are at home with our teenagers. And so doing some good push out to them about what the emotions are of transitions, of how to process transitions, as well as sharing any kind of resources and mental health resources with your parents and your students are always a really good idea. So moving on, we also want to really affirm that we're all in this together. And so we had 206 people that did the answers to the survey that was open last week, but let's see where everybody is calling in from on this call. So David, if we could launch that other poll. So you take a minute. There you go.
Just waiting for a few more of our attendees to vote. Okay, wrapping up. So as we see, most of you are from the US and Canada, which makes sense given our time zone currently. Mexico, South America, South and Central Asia, and East Asia Pacific are the others. Thanks so much, everyone.
So thank you. That's an interesting contrast with the next slide, because even though you may be listening from North America at the moment, that may not be where your school community is located. So that's the other disconnect that I think that we're dealing with, is we may or may not physically be in the same location as our school community, as our student community. So you see, we actually had a huge range of global respondents on the survey. And one of the things that I found an interesting slice about it, if we could see on the next slide, is that actually, due to the timing of this webinar and due to the timing of the survey, most of the responses came in before the traditional May 1st deposit deadline from the United States. Now, we know that several universities in the United States have moved their deadlines to June or July, but I found that was interesting, just sort of thinking of the mental headspace of where the majority of respondents might have been, that there was a little bit less certainty on the part of the student if they were headed to North America, or if they were headed to the United States in particular, even though we actually did not ask that question. We did not ask where the majority of your students are matriculating. The other thing that happened, thank you, all of you guys who are on screens. If we could go back for a second, David. A lot of you that, you're on screens, you got that email from International ACAC headquarters, so bing. Most of our diversity of regions was in the early parts of when the survey was open. And so there were a little bit more sort of European or British focused questions in the latter part of the respondents. Going on. So we're really looking to share ideas today about transition programming, of how do we prepare our students in such a time of uncertainty and a lack of knowing what's coming next. How do we prepare them for something that we don't know? So many schools are using the online platforms, are doing virtual check-ins, meetings with students, etc. So many people are trying to do some kind of transition programming, at least for students. Unfortunately, for some schools in the current climate, that has been one of the things to go. And so Ellen is going to talk a little bit later, but one of our concerns collectively is, particularly for those of you who are on the higher ed side listening, whether or not these guys are going to have any kind of preparation for not only leaving but also entering. So there, as we know, a huge amount of uncertainty in any kind of planning or programming. So on the next slide, the very first thing that I would suggest was do something. Please do something. Please help your students and your parents understand that even though this is the wild, wild west of transitions, it is still a transition that can follow some of the regular feedback or the regular pattern of transitions. So, you could do a webinar, you could do a screencast, you could just share a little bit of information about building a raft. Several schools have been doing virtual coffees with parents. And again, like I said before, really sending a resource list of professional resources, mental health well-being resources to your students and your parents. Now, some schools have been quite lucky in that they were doing their transition programming before they were forced to close. And so students have been getting some of these. And some schools, as we know, particularly in China and Vietnam, opened this past week. And so they have been able to come back to some of the programming things. But really, in those countries where lockdown and stay-at-home orders are in line, parents and caregivers can be a great resource of connecting positively with their child and teaching a lot of those life skills, the sewing, the cooking, the changing a bike tire, those kinds of things. Now, on your webinars, what you might want to consider is, again, really embracing the positivity of this technology and bringing in lots of different experts. So let's say that you happen to be in North America and your school community is in Southeast Asia. Is there someone around you in the North American context that can provide information and resources to your students wherever they may be? So can you connect with a local expert, a psychologist, a family physician? Can you, group webinar topics or webinar groups by time zone, like I mentioned before? Or could you collaborate with others? There's so much that we're having to do right now and it's exhausting. That could you collaborate with, 2 or 3 other schools or in your network of counselors, and then one of you creates the slides that are appropriate for your particular school context, and then share it out with all of the schools in that particular city or region. There's lots of university webinars. Thank you for that. And so just one final thing, if the universities are doing, onboarding webinars, making sure that you have access to those. Okay, now what about graduation? Graduation as a ceremony is a very typical culturally sort of really US American thing. So I definitely acknowledge that the calendar in the Southern Hemisphere is quite different, and not all countries or cultures have this tradition of sort of farewelling students in a ceremonial way. But still, lots of international schools do have this as part of their moving on procedures. And really in the survey respondents, I think that most people are doing some kind of virtual or online or hybrid approach to graduation. Some people don't know what those plans are yet. In many cases, these plans and ideas are not being held at the school counselor level, but they're being held at an administrative or school-wide level, and the school counselor is not part of those conversations. But let's share a few ideas on what could be happening with graduation ceremonies. So next one, please. One thing that's really important, and I'm not sure that all schools are able to, given the time constraints, or have chosen to, but student voice and choice in the planning of the celebration is actually really important. And one of the things that anthropologists talk about and psychologists talk about is what is at the core of the ritual? What is at the center of the ritual? So some schools actually have chosen to survey students and parents and say, what is the piece that you would like to keep the most? And then focus their energies on that piece. Lots of schools, and this is globally, not just in the international school context, lots of schools have chosen to do sort of a care package or a gift or mailing to their students wherever they may be. What you see, the photo there at the bottom, is taken here in my neighborhood on a walk of the seniors at our local public school have, it's a very American thing, these lawn signs that they put in. And so then they can say, a senior lives in this house. And so you can sort of pass by and celebrate and sort of mourn that loss of their final semester of school. Another idea that a colleague of mine talked about was that you could, again, use technology for good instead of evil and exhaustion. And that's to have seniors post messages to each other or thank yous to their teachers, really to affirm the closure of this chapter and affirm the journey that they have been on as the class of 2020. And you could post those on Flipgrid, you could post those on Padlet. So lots of different ways that you can actually still virtually have this kind of celebration. And already, as we know, our membership has been crowdsourcing some great ideas. So here are those 2 spreadsheets that have been being passed around on our International ACAC Facebook group. Absolutely, thank you for those of you who have populated it, and that's a really great place to go and maybe even share some ideas with your admin team. So that's how we can affirm our students and what they've been doing, and that is also how we can really reconcile ourselves to the fact that this is an uncertain situation. Now I'm going to pass it over to Ellen.
Great, thank you, Aleka. So we're moving on our raft to the F for farewells. And my section is just a moment for all of us to think about the importance of saying goodbye, what we're saying goodbye to, and what the grieving experience is like. So we'll go to the next slide. Before I explain a couple of different kinds of grief, I just wanted to say I wanted to explain or highlight this weird experience that we're all having right now as we are preparing our students to say goodbye to their high school, to their secondary schools, to say goodbye to their friends, to say goodbye to the countries they were living in, and getting them ready for their gap year or for university. This time around is obviously quite different. And they're saying goodbye to a lot more than what they typically say goodbye to. And in fact, we're all saying goodbye to a long list of some obvious things and some not so obvious things. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we are saying goodbye to. But before I do that, I would also want to just talk about how, how important it is to say goodbye. And as Leka said, do something. Please do something. Do some sort of transitions experience for your kids. When we say goodbye, when we have the opportunity to say goodbye, it helps us arrive better at our next destination. And we know that. We also know that in this time of great stress for all of us, when we can name our losses and understand the feelings that we're having around those losses, it helps us to decrease our stress. So that's another reason why it's important to say goodbye. It also helps us to develop healthier relationships in the future. So that arriving well part, when you get to university, when you get to gap year, when you get to the next thing, if you've had some healthy goodbyes, if you acknowledge some of your losses, then you're more likely to enter into new experiences and new relationships with a sense of security. And then finally, when we don't grieve our losses, then we may experience a delayed grief. And that is really, it can create more mental health issues in the future. Sorry, one second. Sorry for the sound. There's a background in the sound. I apologize. Anyway, so what are some of the grief experiences we might be having? There's ambiguous grief, which is this feeling of being in limbo, where we might be experiencing loss and grieving, and yet also having a good day. There's this experience of psychological absence with physical presence. So it could be that we are far away from loved ones and we're grieving that while we are physically present or while we see them on Zoom. There's this experience called disenfranchised grief, which is something that if you're familiar working with third culture kids, you might be quite familiar with this term. It's the kind of grief that we don't acknowledge as a society. So this could be something like when you lose a pet and people might say, get over it, it's just a dog. I was talking to someone that does not work in education, and I was saying how sad I felt for the students who didn't get to have a physical graduation this year. And they said, get over it, it's just graduation. So that kind of a statement is saying it's not appropriate for you to grieve. It's not appropriate for you to feel sad, maybe especially when other people are feeling sad or suffering more. And that disenfranchised grief can lead to things like anxiety and depression in the future, unresolved grief. Then there's also anticipatory grief, which is the grief that we experience when we are expecting loss. And I expect that a lot of our seniors and teachers might be feeling this of graduation is coming up and I am already anticipating that grief that I may feel. And then there's traumatic grief, which is the kind of grief that is so concerning that that's when you want to refer your students to a therapist or a psychologist, or refer yourself to a psychologist. And that's when our grief is so severe And it stays with us for so long that we, for weeks and weeks and weeks, we can't sleep, we can't eat, we can't work, when it really starts to disrupt our day. Okay, next slide. So as I said, how do we say goodbye? One of the things we have to do is we have to acknowledge our losses. And so again, in a regular time before the pandemic, the losses our students might be experiencing might be, having to say goodbye to friends, a loss of friendship, loss of being in a country that we love, being in a culture we're familiar with. And of course we gain a lot as the next step of transitions. But in this case, there's a lot of other losses that we're all experiencing. So we may lose loved ones because of this virus. We may have had to move abruptly with our families, and so we might have lost our home. We've lost a sort of physical connection, maybe freedom to walk around, and for our students to be a little more independent. And I think the other thing that we can think about for our students is this idea of losing our idea of our future selves. I imagine my freshman year at university to look like this, and now it's not. And so now that's a loss that I need to acknowledge. And so this just hopefully gives you a sense of sort of what we're all experiencing and also what your students might be experiencing. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what does grief look like in practice or sort of an experience? It could be any of these things that you see here. All of these are human reactions to grief, human expressions of grief. They become problematic when it lasts for over a long period of or a prolonged period of time, if it really interrupts our ability to work and our regular daily habits. But this is all fairly typical. What you might be seeing if you're working in a school, what you might be seeing in some of your students is anger, as Aleka said. You might see sadness. And you might see emotional detachment and social withdrawal, which a lot of the schools I work with are starting to report that their seniors are not really being present as much. Now, that's also fairly typical at the end of a school year, pre-pandemic. But right now, I imagine that some of that social withdrawal and emotional detachment that you might be seeing is sort of the way that students are reacting to this loss of being able to be together with everybody. And so in order to protect themselves, in order to protect their feelings, they might start to kind of step back. So, okay, so we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so how do you take care of yourself and how do you take care of your students? When we help our kids say goodbye and help our kids in this part of the transition piece, one of the first things we need to do is check in with our own experience with goodbyes and with our own experience with loss. And so I'm sharing this list with you as far as these might be things that you can help your students do to help feel better. But I also hope that these are things that you can do because we do have to model taking care of ourselves during these times of grieving. So you can see here's some certain different ideas. Practicing self-care is probably the most obvious one. A couple of things I wanted to just highlight. It's really important that we don't compare our loss or any kind of pain we might be feeling to other people's pain. Sometimes we might say, well, I don't have it that bad because that person has it a lot worse. And that perspective can be helpful, but you don't want it to then negate your experience or your giving yourself a moment to feel your own pain. You also don't want to judge other people's grieving. We all grieve differently. We all experience loss differently. So, be compassionate to yourself and be compassionate to others as we're saying our goodbyes. And then, connecting with people and talking with people. As you're planning your transitions, programming for the end of the school year, and you're planning your graduation, make sure that a lot of this is social, that there's opportunities for us to connect to groups and to individuals in all different kinds of ways, because we know that relationship part is so important and that it helps to decrease our stress as we go through all of this together. Next slide. I just wanted to share this. You've probably seen this going around, but this is a little excerpt. We've got Pooh and Piglet, and Piglet's having a difficult day. I'm sorry, Pooh is having a difficult day, and Piglet says, "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," said Pooh after a bit. "No, I don't think I do." "That's okay," said Piglet, and he came and sat beside his friend. "What are you doing?" asked Pooh. "Nothing really," said Piglet, "only I know what difficult days are like. I quite often don't like talking about it on my difficult days either." "But goodness," continued Piglet, "difficult days are so much easier when you know you've got someone there for you, and I'll always be there for you." And as Pooh sat there working through in his head his difficult day, while the solid, reliable Piglet sat next to him, quietly swinging his little legs, he thought that his best friend had never been more right. It's a sweet little story that I wanted to share with all of you, and to say, one of our jobs as counselors is to be that Piglet for our students, but also, to be that Piglet for each other. So if we can do this, if we can grieve together, if we can say our goodbyes together, we're modeling that for our kids, and we're making sure that everyone transitions off to university and to their gap years and whatever is coming up next for our students, that they transition there healthfully, open-minded, and feeling secure about creating new relationships and new experiences. Thank you.
Okay, so I have Think Destination, and I'm going to talk about reframing the uncertainty and inviting student ownership as much as we can. As counselors, we work with all, regardless of whether someone is a pessimist or an optimist. And so that's why I chose this graphic about the glass half full or half empty, because how we approach a problem really has a lot to do with how we're going to resolve it and how we're going to feel about the situation if we're going through it. So next slide, David. Reframing to the positive, using positive language, optimistic language. As counselors, we can help people reframe self-talk. We can help reframe our conversations with others and our general outlook. And I'm going to give some examples. If we were talking about a gap year, what I wanted to say about, go ahead and advance, David. Instead of saying, I might have, in a panic, I might have to take a gap year. You could reframe it to, wow, there are so many amazing things I could do with a gap year. And it's true, in my experience, especially with UK universities, it is a very respected thing to do, and it can be a very positive choice. And there are, in fact, many opportunities. Another example, one might say, they're never going to tell us what's happening this fall, versus they must be really busy trying to decide what to do this fall. Maybe I'd better call them and check in, and I'll talk more about that kind of thing later. Another example is, I don't want to go there if they're going to start online, becomes there are thousands of people already studying for their degrees online. This pandemic will pass and things will get back to normal. Online in the fall, that's the next thing that I had put up there. Think about it in the context as we communicate with students. In 3 years' time, even if you do start online, in 3 years, you're going to be part of that university that you had chosen. And I did a lot of thinking about being part of the solution for high school students to recognize that they're already moving in the direction of their university, and to be part of creating something new, whatever that's going to be. It can be an opportunity to make a difference, just like they were looking for opportunities to make a difference, to be unique, to be standing out from the crowd when they were in high school. And think about destination as a long-term commitment. I think that I've thought a bit about the concept of loyalty too. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. So student ownership in the journey, you can advance, David. For the class of 2020, our job, what we want to try to do with students is to encourage them to press in to their chosen university. They're moving away from high school, they're moving to something new. Avoid broad brushstrokes. And what I'm talking about here is when students apply the US timeline or logic or process to the UK and blending things, mixing things up. And the stresses and the anxieties that students feel are different based on when, where they're going, and the reality that the conditional offer doesn't change to unconditional until July, and the A levels don't come out until August. So that's very different from the May 1 commitment deadline. And encourage students to ask the university staff questions directly. I think that's really important on their journey towards independence. And shifting their focus from us to the university admissions, international staff, and fellow students, the Facebook pages, their future roommate, etc. And I think there's something to be said for honoring, and this is the last bullet there, David, honoring the time and research that went into their university choice, and then to be sticking with their choice. And that's what I referred to in the previous one as well. If students have really gone into great depth and own their choices, the list, and then their final destination, you got to love your safety. And so I think you want to be encouraging students to be committed that way. Now, I want to, when Aleka and I were talking on a phone call one day, I was reminded of an experience I had with a riptide, and we thought that we'd talk about this just a little bit. Once off the coast of Mexico with some teacher friends and some students, I was caught in a riptide, and I didn't know what to do about it. And one of the students who had a boogie board tried to get to me, but we had a teacher with us, a good friend, who grew up in Southern California and surfing, and he knew how to get out of a riptide. And he coached me through it, basically turning over on your back, face up, a slow, easy kick, moving your hands, not getting your heart rate up, and breathing, and then going parallel to the shore until you actually exit. And in a way, I guess this is an analogy for how we're waiting till things open up, till we can go, till we can do. And so rather than panicking, rather than having, allowing stress to control, to kind of just relax and breathe and move with it until it moves on, until we get out of the rip current. So I think there's some strategies for dealing with this situation that's out of our control. And then I thought of this, just the power of language again. What can we do, or what we can do? The way you say something, the emphasis on certain words can be important. And then Aleka mentioned this at the beginning, but leaning back into counseling, listening, asking open-ended questions, a student-centered approach, where we're not the expert, even if we are, but to empower students to take charge. And then the last slide that I had was just sharing some ideas, and this is along the lines of empowering young people on their path towards independence. And many of them are already independent 18-year-old adults, and yet here they are caught in this situation. encouraging self-advocacy. Pick up the phone, call, send an email, and then asking open-ended questions and listening. And then I'll wrap it up with a couple of things, just personal notes on staying positive. Because I've been in my own transition, having left Dubai and left my school, Jumeirah Baccalaureate School, and starting something new. Things that I have in my life that are important. And what I've noticed with the global response to COVID-19 is people are turning to music. You have healthcare workers coming up with dance routines in the hallways. You have artists sharing their unplugged with us in intimate ways that we rarely see. But for me, as a music person, music and dance, and then I think poetry and art and journaling. I was thinking about journaling. It's a good time to keep kind of a running record of what you're going through. And getting close to the water, whether it's a stream, a river, the ocean, a lake, can have some real healing qualities. Gardening, getting your hands dirty, getting into the earth. And I personally love campfires. Every chance I get, we go to our little camp lot and I have a campfire. And then a couple of songs have been really significant for me. In one of them is "The Smile," and there's a lot of songs with that title, but by the Charlie Chapman. And Lady Gaga just did a version of it on the Some Good News episode. And first two lines: "Smile though your heart is aching. Smile even though it's breaking." And I would do the whole song for you, but there just isn't time for that. And the other one that recently I tuned back into was "I Hope You Dance." And one of the lines in that song is, "Whenever one door closes, I hope one more opens." And then the SGN series, I finally this morning watched episodes 5 and 6. And as I think back over these 5 weeks, I don't think there's been any single thing that I've watched where I've gone through more Kleenex or gotten a hanky wetter, because I'm laughing, I'm crying tears of joy, and I'm seeing things that just warm my heart and give me hope. And I just, if you haven't seen any of those, they're well worth 20 minutes to sit down and watch, because they're really encouraging. And before I started, I didn't even know who John Krasinski was. So you never know what you're going to discover. So
Bernie, I just want to say you're getting some requests to finish the song.
Oh my goodness.
So you don't have to. I'm just pointing out that your fans have spoken.
Well, I might stumble on a couple parts. I just don't quite have what Lady Gaga's got. But smile though your heart is aching, smile even though it's breaking. When there are clouds in the sky, you'll get by. If you smile through your pain and sorrow, smile and maybe tomorrow you'll see the sun come shining through for you. Light up your face with gladness, hide every trace of sadness. Although a tear may be ever so near, that's the time you must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is so worthwhile if you'll just smile. All right.
Yay.
David, next time we're going to get the guitars out and we're going to do a song.
That sounds
together.
good.
Oh, Bernie, thank you so much for that.
Hmm.
Thank
That was
you.
beautiful.
That
That
made
was
me
really
cry.
beautiful.
I can't believe I got through it without crying. Actually.
I'm impressed. I'm impressed.
We love you. We love
Oh,
you, Bernie. Thank you.
thank you, Bernie. Before we take any more questions, just a quick sharing these resources with you. We didn't want to overload you with a bunch of resources that are out there. So we really tried to pick some of the best things that are out there. You probably already know about ISCA's resources for COVID-19. The Council of International Schools has done a bunch of work around well-being and university admissions. Sea Change has a whole COVID resources around relationships and well-being and faculty well-being. SPAN, Safe Pastures Across Networks, has a whole video series, but the episode 2 is a conversation about specific graduation ritual ideas. And then I wanted to share the Times Educational Supplement just put out an excellent article. I think it's the best thing out there, written thing that's out there on how we help kids return to school in a healthy way. And there's a framework there that can help guide your decision making. So hopefully that's helpful for all of you. I'm still reeling from Bernie's song. That was so beautiful.
I know. There's no way to, Bernie, that was just stunning. Gorgeous.
You know, a little side on that. By no means is that meant to convey that we need to stuff our feelings and not feel them. I remember in high school, my own experience, especially my senior year. I was one of those bouncy Bernie, and I was one of those people who, if I wasn't happy, if I wasn't having a good day, people could tell. And I always got so irritated when I was walking down the hall and somebody would go, "What's wrong, Bernie? What's wrong?" Because I was usually smiling. But every once in a while, you can get down enough over something that you just have a hard time. And so I think Charlie Chaplin was onto something with the words. And I haven't yet, but I'm going to go look at some Charlie Chaplin videos just to find that connection to his sense of humor in there.
Yeah.
Excellent. Any other comments about these links, Aleka?
I've put them in the chat just in case you want to cut paste right now. And I've also added the Google Sheets, the crowdsourcing that our membership has been doing about graduation ideas. That's also in the chat. But as David said, this is being recorded, thank goodness, because we have Bernie Lanou live a cappella for all time. And also, David, I know that you're going to be sending the slides out to participants afterwards, and so they can access those.
That's
links.
right. Absolutely. So you'll be able to get the slides within hopefully within a day or two. This is a huge incentive, Bernie, for me to put this on the Facebook group now. So everyone can hear your voice. The next time we'll do a duet for sure. But at this point, I just want to thank all of our panelists for a really great webinar today. It's been really enjoyable for me as moderator to sit here and especially to listen to you, Bernie. But now is a great time for questions. And so we'd love to ask you to submit your questions to the question and answer panel. Thank you, Tracy, for asking the first question. So our panelists, maybe you can see as well, but do you guys have any advice for counselors who are switching school communities right now? Or hoping maybe to travel when visas reopen?
So just to clarify, Tracy, does that mean that you as a counselor are, and you can put this answer in the Q&A box if you want, that you yourself are in transition? So you are currently moving schools? Is that what we think the answer is, the question's about?
I think that's what she's trying to say.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Tracy. I mean, I think that's the difficulty of everything that Ellen has said and everything that I have mentioned about transitioning well. Bernie, if you could hold up the Third Culture Kids book for us, since you have it right there. Okay. So if you don't know this resource, Third Culture Kids by Ruth Van Raken, and the updated edition by Michael Pollack, the original edition with David Pollack, and Michael Pollack has added his insights to it. This is a wonderful, wonderful resource for cross-cultural adults, students, children, families who are moving from school to school. And so if you haven't read that already, I would suggest that you do, as in it's really important to be able to grieve, have tears. We have to grieve well in order to leave well. And so finding ways, Tracy, for you to say goodbye to your school community, for your students, for you to affirm this chapter in your life in all of its ways, including its messy ending, that's really, really important for you in order to transition well to that next school. Because there are a lot of logistics, there's lots of things, but you really need to make sure that those emotions are handled as well.
Interesting that this question comes up first. I was just on a call this afternoon, in fact, with the folks at the American School of Brasilia, EAB, all of the new teachers and their director of learning and their principals. And it was all about dealing with the uncertainty. What is happening in Brazil? What is the government going to do? What are they going to do in that district? What is the school going to do? How are we going to take care of you? You've signed a contract. You're coming. It's not normal. And so if the school hasn't initiated something like that, the reason I'm doing it is I'm going to do a maternity leave cover for a few months at that school in Brasilia. So I'm part of that group. If they haven't done that, maybe you could initiate something with the group of new teachers and somebody in the administration.
Yeah, I'd also suggest, maybe going right now, since everything is virtual, you can, I'm so sorry, my husband's cooking dinner and I don't know if you can hear that, but what can I say? I live in New York City in a small apartment. They're bringing pots and pans for the medical workers. My husband's cooking dinner and, what can I say? We're all juggling a lot right now.
It sounds really yummy.
It smells good if you want to know. Someday we'll have smell-o-vision, but until then, just take my word for it. But what I was going to say is that, you might want to, and this is a good idea for your kids too, for students that might be transitioning to another school, is right now schools are having social groups, trivia nights, those kinds of things, in order to sustain their school culture with faculty. And so maybe you can reach out to the school that you're going to and ask to be included in some of those. So you get a sense of the culture and you can start feeling hopeful about what you're going to. And that might kind of make the transition a little easier for you.
Well, Ellen, you got a lot of good comments in support of your husband cooking, so that's good. That's helpful. I know I had dismissed this question by mistake, but there was a question about, are any of you seeing any kind of cuts in financial aid from U.S. universities right now? Are you noticing that? Have you heard that feedback from your students? There was just a question from one of our attendees.
I think that we saw, thanks David, we saw that a lot in the survey, actually. Again, one of those questions of how can I support my student when I don't know if they're going to have the aid that they were counting on, if they're going to have a campus that is open for them to come on. So the three of us don't have that answer, but back to Bernie's advice of encouraging the student to reach out directly. I mean, David, I know that as a higher ed individual yourself, you guys are putting out hours of content, a ton of webinars. You really are trying to welcome and carry and meet those students that are coming into your community where they are. You're reaching out and meeting them where they are, and you're bringing them on board. And so encouraging the students to reach out if they have a financial aid package on the table, if really reach out personally and individually to those universities and continue to build those bridges, I think would be a way to go.
That's very helpful, thanks. We have another question that says it's more kind of oriented towards parents. How do you approach parents' concerns about their kids not being able to experience the traditional onboarding processes to their academic institutions? I'm guessing maybe this is referring to to orientation, maybe some pre-arrival meetings, but or attending orientation sessions, living on campus. How do you help your parents in their understanding concerns about that?
Well, I can say what I would have done last year, and that is what a unique opportunity to let go and let your young adult take some chances, some leadership, to assert themselves, to begin to fly on their own. I've worked with some populations over the years that are very, very sheltered, very, very taken care of, and I appreciated Aleka's, comments about cooking, cleaning, laundry, changing a bicycle tire. If I had a parent who was in crisis over that kind of issue, then that's kind of what my counsel to them would be. And then I would be trying to help them deal with their own issues around letting go and trusting their young adult.
Yeah, I think the thing that's hard for parents right now, teenagers are stuck inside with their parents. That's not a best case scenario for most adolescents, right? Adolescents developmentally need to be gaining their independence. They need to be relying on their peers. FOMO is real. Like that's a big thing for these guys. We know that. That's a lot of what you're probably hearing when you're talking to your students. But I think that we need to equip parents, because for the first time, they're really holding that grief. Whereas the school has been able to hold that grief up to this point and really carry them over the finish line. And parents are having to do this ad hoc, as well as grieve themselves on the loss of the symbolic ritual that we have in sort of modern society, that this is a moving on, a moving out of the nest as it was. So really equipping parents with just even the basic emotional skills of this is what is going to happen. Even if you just take Ellen's slide of like social withdrawal is normal. We would expect it at this point. Just giving parents sort of some of those toolkits, because they're having to do a lot of that work on their own.
Mm-hmm. And there's the fear factor too. Could the virus spring up again? Is it not over? What am I going into? Because everybody's dealt with this social isolation and masks and things, grocery stores, in different ways. So it could be the fear as well.
David, there's a question here in the chat. Do you mind if I highlight it? It's Margaret Grant. You said, how do you remotivate students who still have exams to do in June and July and who are currently not even showing interest in attending online classes? Aleka just mentioned the social withdrawal piece. I'm hearing a lot of this right now. And the first thing I want to say is that also might be that social withdrawal. Like, why should I stick around? It's a way to protect ourselves. But I would ask the students, think of the students whose greatest skills are connecting with other people and motivating other people to have fun and to bond, and ask those students, how might we re-engage people and have them think about why that's important and ask them for help, bring them in on your team. I think this is a really good time to have fun with each other. Like, Bernie just made this webinar epic and legendary with his song. It's unexpected and it's moving, it's playful, and we really appreciate it. You can do the same kinds of things with your students, like just have a trivia night, just have kind of get inspired by TikTok and have a dance off. But find really fun things we need fun, we need laughter, we need to bond right now before it's really time to say goodbye. So ask your students, think differently, and ask them ways to engage, and don't be scared of play and humor and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That might be an excellent way to end. I don't think we have any other questions. It's a great kind of final parting words from Ellen. So thank you so much for that. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank our panelists for joining us this evening and for this great discussion. As a reminder, you'll be able to review the slides again and this recording very, very soon. Promise me, we want to make sure that this lives on for many, many years to come. So I hope all of you have a wonderful evening or morning or day wherever you are on this earth. And we thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
David.
you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
David.
My pleasure. I can only
Be well, everybody.
how to stop this.